Does God exist? Let's take a look at some of the traditional arguments for belief in God and see what we think. First, let's define God as we like to in philosophy. When we make that sound God, what we're meaning is an all-powerful, perfect, independent entity. All-powerful meaning not lacking in any ability. Perfect in the sense of unchanging, complete. Independent meaning not subject to the laws of nature and separate from thought. Well, all right. Let's take a look at some of these proofs of the existence of God. Traditionally, there's 4 types, and we're going to start with the one that's probably the most difficult to get your head around, the ontological argument. We get it from a guy named Anselm of Canterbury at the turn of the millennium, although he's not the only one to present this type of argument. The ontological argument basically says that God's existence follows from the very concept of God. All right, let's take a look at this. Anselm says, God is that than which no greater can be thought. Okay, God is that which no greater can be thought. So you think of the greatest independent, all-powerful, perfect entity that you can conceive of. And Anselm would say, well, if you can conceive of it, that proves that God exists. Now, most of us would say, well, that doesn't seem to prove it to me. It seems to prove that I'm having such a thought, but the fact that I'm thinking about it doesn't somehow mean that it actually exists any more than if I think of a perfect island in the Pacific, that it has to exist. Now, some would say to this, but one of the characteristics of a perfect island is not existing. You can think of a perfect island, but it doesn't have to exist because it isn't meant to exist. It doesn't have to exist. But God, on the other hand, if you think of God as existing, which you have to do if you're going to think of the greatest thing, is in fact proving that God exists. Let's try another way of looking at this. What he's saying is that the idea of God existing external to one's mind is greater than the idea of God as an idea in one's mind. So Anselm is saying greater means actually existing. If when you think of the greatest being thinkable, that than which no greater can be thought, if you're thinking of it only as an idea in your mind, then you're not actually thinking of the greatest thing. You are thinking of something less. You're thinking of just an idea. So interestingly, we have this picture taken from the Sistine Chapel, painted by Michelangelo, from that section called The Creation. Here we have God reaching out, almost touching humankind in this act of creation. And Michelangelo depicts God reclined with his cherubs on this couch that he paints to look curiously like a human brain. And perhaps what Michelangelo is saying is that God is in our minds. Well, okay, not everyone's convinced by this highly rationalistic argument. not the least of which were God-believing people like Immanuel Kant himself. He said, well, existence does not necessarily equate to greatness. But more on that in another video. Let's take a look at the cosmological argument. Thomas Aquinas is well known for this argument. He made 5 arguments for belief in God, and they fall into different categories. Some of them are the cosmological argument that says certain contingent features of the world can only be explained by the existence of God as a necessary being. Necessary, in other words, to have created and caused these contingent features in the world. Contingent meaning they only exist because of something else. Aquinas, of course, was in the tradition of Aristotle, meaning look out at the world and discover truth. And he believed that as you look at the world and look at nature, look at the cosmos, that it will lead you to God. And all truth that you discover is God's truth. Well, what does this mean, this contingency in the cosmological argument? Well, he's saying here that if you look at the fact that things are in motion, or that things have been caused, motion, causation, contingency, or that things that exist or happen have to have a cause, meaning they're contingent. You realize as you chase them back as to what put things in motion, what caused things. For instance, as depicted in the picture here, you can see one domino has knocked over the other. You would say, well, the first domino is knocked over by the one before it, and the one before it knocked that one, and the one before. Well, eventually, what caused these dominoes to get going? Well, someone's finger. And what caused that? And eventually, you'd have to chase it back to the fact that there has to be a prime mover, as it were. The fact that things are in motion, or that things only exist that could have been caused, proves that there has to be an original first cause. And who could that be other than God? Aquinas also makes an argument for the existence of God based on the existence of morals and also on a teleological basis. We can, in fact, take a look at the teleological argument now. Teleological argument basically says the universe is an intricate system of balanced mechanisms that can only be explained in terms of purposes and intelligence. So as you look at this sandcastle, you would be hard-pressed to believe that that happened by chance, that the waves just happened to toss the sand into this sort of arrangement. And of course, no one would believe that. Well, by way of analogy, that's what this argument is saying, is that as you look out at the world, you see that some things seem to imply an architect, design, and purpose. This is what we mean by teleological. Telos, meaning purpose. And that there's no other way to explain that design that we see in nature other than it was placed there by the greatest of all designers, architects, that being God. Well, you could even take it on a deeper level and look at something like the design of DNA. Well, these are teleological arguments. Well, now let's look at the moral argument. Many of you are probably familiar with C.S. Lewis, who was the author of the Chronicles of Narnia and many other famous works. He makes the moral argument in this way. Moral facts aren't descriptive, telling you what is. They're prescriptive, telling you what ought to be. Moral facts don't exist like physical things. Yet, without them, there are no laws. Moral facts exist, so they must have a source, which is God. All right, well, so Lewis is saying that moral facts don't exist like physical things exist. Yet they exist in the same way that numbers exist. And without them, we have no basis of law. Now, he's saying more than simply, therefore, we need a belief in God so that we can have laws. He's saying there's no explanation for the fact that we have laws, that we have created laws, other than to believe that they must originate somehow with God. As you look out at the universe, you'll find no source for moral facts, for morality. There's nothing in the observable universe that would say you should have these moral laws. And yet, they're ubiquitous. For Lewis, they are a reality, and the only way to explain them is that they have originated in something greater and transcending humanity. Descartes made a very similar argument, that in the same way that a river never rises higher than its source, humankind can't come up with moral facts having no source from which to base it. Well, these are some of the proofs of the existence of God that have been put forth, and not everybody's happy with those answers. We'll take a look at some of the dissatisfied customers in another video.